Every afternoon, at precisely 2:47 p.m., Thomas Mitchell walks the same worn path through Central Park to sit on what he's come to think of as his bench. His weathered hands grip a thermos of coffee that's more about routine than taste these days, a small comfort in a world that seems to have forgotten men like him. At 73, he's watched his retirement savings dwindle and his social circle shrink, leaving him with little more than his dignity and this daily ritual. What Thomas doesn't know is that today's autumn breeze carries more than just fallen leaves. It brings Sarah Anderson, who, despite commanding a technology empire worth billions, sits in boardrooms feeling as alone as Thomas does on his bench. She's traded her usual power suits for a simple sweater, seeking something her vast fortune can't buy, a conversation without agenda, a connection untainted by wealth. As these two souls cross paths on a seemingly ordinary Thursday afternoon, neither realizes they're about to begin a story that will challenge everything they think they know about friendship, worth, and the true meaning of wealth. This is not just another tale of unexpected kindness. This is about how two people from vastly different worlds are about to discover that sometimes the richest conversations happen on the humblest of park benches. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent light in Thomas Mitchell's bathroom flickered 3 times before steadying itself, a morning ritual as familiar as the face staring back at him in the mirror. He adjusted his collar with careful precision, his fingers working. Through the same routine they had for decades. The apartment around him was modest, but meticulously maintained, a testament to his belief that dignity had nothing to do with square footage. On his kitchen table, the stack of envelopes seemed to have multiplied overnight, like unwanted guests at a party he never planned to throw. Most bore the logo of Mount Sinai Hospital, a reminder of Margaret's final months. Thomas had always prided himself on paying his bills on time, a habit ingrained by parents who lived through the Depression. But lately, that stack had become a mountain he couldn't climb. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell." The cheerful voice of Mrs. Rodriguez, his neighbor, drifted through his open window. She was watering the small collection of plants on her fire escape, as she did every morning. "Will you be going to the park today?" "As always, Maria," he replied, managing a smile. "Someone needs to keep an eye on those pigeons." She hesitated, and he knew what was coming. The same concern he'd seen in his daughter's eyes during her last visit from Seattle. "You know, my Carlos is always looking for someone to play chess with in the evenings. Maybe you'd like to—" "Thank you, but I prefer the fresh air." Thomas kept his tone gentle but firm. Mrs. Rodriguez meant well, but he'd grown tired of people trying to fill his empty hours as if they were potholes that needed patching. He turned back to his morning routine, preparing his thermos of coffee with the precision of a chemist. 2 scoops of grounds, water just below boiling, 3 minutes to steep. Margaret had always teased him about his coffee ritual, calling him her mad scientist of morning brew. The memory brought a smile to his face, though it carried the familiar sting that all thoughts of her did now. The kitchen radio hummed quietly in the background, tuned to the classical station. Beethoven's 7th Symphony filled the small space, and Thomas found himself swaying slightly as he washed his breakfast dishes. Music had been their shared passion. He and Margaret had met at a community orchestra rehearsal 46 years ago. She played violin, he played viola. Now his instrument sat in its case in the corner, untouched for months. His eyes drifted to the photos on the wall. Their wedding day, Thomas in his doctoral robes at graduation, Margaret beaming beside him. 28 years of teaching literature. At the community college, shaping young minds, opening doors to worlds bound in paper and ink. He'd loved every minute of it, even if the salary had never matched his enthusiasm. The pension had seemed adequate when he'd retired. But that was before the medical bills, before inflation had turned his careful calculations into wishful thinking. Now each month felt like a mathematical puzzle with too many variables and not enough solutions. He gathered his thermos, checked his wallet out of habit, though he knew exactly what was in it, and straightened his jacket. The morning sunlight caught the edge of the unpaid bills, making the red past due stamps seem to glow accusingly. Thomas turned away, squaring his shoulders. He had his routine, his dignity, and his bench waiting for him in the park. Some days, that had to be enough. Dawn painted Manhattan's skyline in shades of gold, the light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view most people only saw in movies. Sarah Anderson stood at the window of her penthouse, a cup of green tea growing cold in her hands. 48 floors below, the city was already pulsing with energy, but up here, the silence felt absolute. Her phone buzzed for the third time in as many minutes. The board meeting would start in an hour, and Bradley, her CFO, was already sending urgent messages about the Morrison acquisition, a deal worth billions that would make headlines across the financial world. A deal that should have been occupying every corner of her mind. Instead, her attention kept drifting to the small frame photograph on her desk. It showed a much younger Sarah, maybe 7 or 8, sitting on her father's shoulders at Coney Island. Dad wore his mechanic's uniform, grease still visible under his fingernails. Mom stood beside them in her waitress dress, having rushed straight from her morning shift to join them. They looked happy, real. "Ms. Anderson?" Her AI assistant's voice filled the room. "Mr. Chen from the board is requesting an immediate video conference." Sarah sighed. "Decline. Send my standard in strategic planning response." She moved to her closet, a space larger than her childhood apartment had been, and pulled out a simple sweater and slacks. No power suit today. No 4-inch heels or carefully crafted image of the woman who had built Anderson Tech from a startup in her garage to a global empire. Her hand brushed against the shipping plastic still covering her latest designer purchase. A dress that cost more than her parents had made in 3 months. The price tags on her clothes these days could feed a family for a year, yet she couldn't remember the last time she bought something that made her feel like that little girl at Coney Island. "Ms. Anderson, the board is convening in 45 minutes. Shall I have your car brought around?" Sarah stared at her reflection in the mirror. At 45, she had achieved everything she'd set out to do. The financial magazines called her brilliant, ruthless, enigmatic. Forbes had her net worth at just over 11 billion. She had houses she'd never visited, art she'd never really looked at, and a contact list full of people who wanted something from her. "No car today," she said, pulling her hair back into a simple ponytail. "Clear my schedule. Ms. Anderson, the Morrison acquisition can wait." She picked up the photograph from her desk, running a finger along its worn frame. "Sometimes you need to remember where you came from to figure out where you're going." Her phone buzzed again. Bradley's name flashed on the screen, along with a message marked urgent. She turned the phone face down and slipped into her walking shoes. The board would be furious. The business papers would speculate. Her stock might even take a temporary hit. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Sarah Anderson felt like she could breathe. She took one last look at the photograph before placing it carefully back on her desk. Her father had always told her that success meant nothing if you lost yourself along the way. Somehow, somewhere between the IPO and the billion-dollar valuations, she'd forgotten that. The elevator ride down was silent, free from the usual parade of assistants briefing her on meetings and market projections. In the lobby, her security team moved to follow, but she waved them off with a firm shake of her head. Just another face in the crowd, that's what she needed today. Outside, the October air carried the first real bite of autumn. Sarah turned away from her usual route, away from the corporate canyons of Manhattan's financial district, and headed toward Central Park. Somewhere in this city of millions, she hoped to find something that billions couldn't buy. A genuine connection, a conversation without agenda, a moment of truth in a life that had become a carefully constructed performance. The bench had always been Thomas's private domain at this hour, a front-row seat to the afternoon theatre of Central Park. He watched a young couple attempting to photograph their reluctant toddler near the fountain, the child more interested in chasing pigeons than posing for posterity. It reminded him of similar struggles with his own daughter decades ago. He was just unscrewing his thermos when he sensed, rather than saw, someone approaching. A woman, probably in her 40s, paused near the bench's empty end. She wore simple clothes that nevertheless spoke of quality, her manner suggesting someone used to moving through the world with purpose. "Would you mind if I sat for a moment?" Her voice was gentle, almost hesitant. Thomas gestured to the empty space, noting how she seemed to deliberately leave room between them. The silence that followed wasn't exactly uncomfortable, but it held the awkward awareness of strangers sharing space. A bold pigeon landed near their feet, head cocking as it studied them for potential handouts. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a few crumbs from his morning toast. "You're not supposed to feed them, you know," the woman said, though her tone carried amusement rather than reproach. "Ah, but these are special pigeons," Thomas replied, watching the birds strut closer. "They're educated. This fellow here, I'm pretty sure he's working on his master's thesis in philosophy. See how contemplative he looks?" She laughed then, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. "What's his thesis topic?" "The Existential Implications of Breadcrumbs, a Study in Avian Metaphysics." Thomas delivered it with perfect academic seriousness and was rewarded with another laugh. "I'm Sarah," she offered, watching as more pigeons joined their philosophical colleague. "Thomas." He hesitated, then lifted his thermos. "Would you like some coffee? It's nothing fancy, but I've been told I brew a decent cup." Sarah seemed to consider the offer carefully, as if it carried more weight than a simple question about coffee. "Actually, I would. Thank you." He pulled out the spare cup he always carried, force of habit from when Margaret was alive, and poured carefully. The familiar aroma of coffee filled the space between them, making the bench feel suddenly more intimate, like a cafe table. "For two." "This is good," Sarah said after taking a sip, genuine appreciation in her voice. "Really good." 3 minutes steep time, water just below boiling, Thomas explained. "The secret is in the timing." They fell into an easier silence then, watching the park's daily parade. A group of tourists consulting their phones and arguing about directions. An elderly woman walking a tiny dog wearing a sweater that matched her own. 2 chess players at a nearby table locked in silent combat over their board. "Do you come here often?" Sarah asked, then smiled at how much it sounded like a line from a dated romance novel. "Every day, weather permitting," Thomas replied. "It's my front-row seat to humanity's ongoing performance art piece." "That's a lovely way to put it." She turned slightly toward him. "What's playing today?" "Ah, well, we have several acts running simultaneously." He gestured to different areas of the park. "Over there we have Tourist's Lament in D minor. By the fountain, Young Love's first Instagram post. And right here, the Philosophical Pigeons Symposium." Their shared laughter felt natural now, the initial awkwardness forgotten. They talked about everything and nothing. The changing colors of the leaves, the best hot dog vendor in the park. They disagreed. The merits of classical music versus jazz. They found common ground. Neither offered much personal information, but somehow that made the conversation feel more rather than less authentic. When Sarah finally stood to leave, the shadows had lengthened considerably. "Thank you for the coffee," she said, "and the company." "The bench is always here," Thomas replied, surprising himself with the implicit invitation. She smiled, a warm gesture that reached her eyes. "So I see." Then she was gone, blending into the flow of park visitors with practiced ease. Thomas sat for a while longer, aware that the bench felt different now. No longer just his private theatre seat, but something more like a shared space. The empty coffee cup sat beside his thermos, a small token of connection in a city where such things were increasingly rare. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across their bench as Sarah listened to Thomas describe his years of teaching literature at the community college. Her smart watch buzzed silently against her wrist. Another message from Bradley about the Morrison deal, but she kept her hands still in her lap, unwilling to break the spell of the moment. "So there I was," Thomas continued, his eyes bright with memory, trying to explain the significance of Kafka's metamorphosis to a room full of freshmen who thought transforming into a giant bug was, and I quote, "totally rad." He chuckled, shaking his head. "But you know what? By the end of that semester, those same students were writing fascinating papers about alienation and family dynamics." Sarah smiled, genuinely intrigued. "How did you manage that transformation?" "The secret," he said, leaning slightly closer as if sharing confidential information, "is to meet them where they are." One student connected Gregor's situation to social media isolation. Another saw parallels with his own immigrant family's struggles. Once they found their way in, the rest followed naturally. Her watch buzzed again, more insistently this time. Thomas glanced at her wrist, and she casually pulled her sleeve down to cover the device. "Do you need to get that?" "Nothing important," she said, the lie tasting bitter despite its necessity. In truth, her company's stock had probably dropped several points since she'd been sitting here, but somehow that seemed less real than this conversation about teaching Kafka to teenagers. A man in an expensive suit walked past their bench, his attention fixed on his phone. Sarah tensed, recognizing Jason Myers, one of her company's board members. She turned her face slightly, using her hair as a shield until he passed. The moment stretched like a thread about to snap. "You know," Thomas said, apparently not noticing her discomfort, "teaching was never about the curriculum for me. It was about those moments when a student suddenly saw the world differently, when they realized that these old books weren't just assignments, but conversations across time." Sarah relaxed as Jason disappeared down the path, grateful for Thomas's continued story. "Did you have a favorite book to teach?" "To Kill a Mockingbird," he replied without hesitation. "Not just for the obvious lessons about justice and prejudice, but for Scout's journey of understanding, how she learns to see the world through other people's eyes." He paused, looking at her thoughtfully. "That's something we could all stand to practice more, don't you think?" The irony of his words wasn't lost on Sarah. Here she sat, CEO of a technology empire, pretending to be just another park visitor. Was she any better than the characters who hid their true selves in the novels Thomas once taught? Her watch vibrated. Once more. This time she glanced at it surreptitiously. A news alert about Anderson Tech's unexpected leadership absence. The stock had indeed dropped 6 points. "Time has a different quality here," Thomas observed, his voice pulling her back to the present. "Away from all the rushing and beeping of the modern world. Sometimes I think this bench exists in its own time zone." Sarah felt the truth of his words. Here, she wasn't Sarah Anderson, the billionaire CEO whose decisions affected thousands of lives. She was just Sarah, a woman sharing a bench and a conversation with a kind man who saw the world through the lens of literature and humanity. "Did you ever teach any contemporary novels?" she asked, steering the conversation back to safer ground. "Oh, yes, though some of my colleagues considered it heresy." His eyes twinkled. "I once had a student compare The Matrix to Plato's cave. Allegory created quite a stir in the department." As Thomas launched into another teaching anecdote, Sarah felt the familiar weight of her double life pressing down. Every genuine moment they shared made her deception feel heavier, yet every conversation convinced her more that this friendship, built on hidden foundations, though it was, might be the most real thing in her life. Thomas stood in his kitchen, carefully wrapping the oatmeal raisin cookies in wax paper. The recipe card was worn at the edges. Margaret's flowing handwriting faded, but still legible. "Thomas's favorites," she'd written at the top, underlining it twice with a flourish. He'd found it tucked in her old recipe book last night, and something had compelled him to bake for the first time since her passing. The kitchen still held the warm, sweet scent of baking. He'd had to substitute a few ingredients. Butter wasn't cheap these days, but the essence of Margaret's recipe remained. As he wrapped the last cookie, he wondered if he was being foolish. Bringing homemade treats to share with a stranger in the park seemed like something from a different era, when people weren't so guarded, so suspicious of simple kindness. Yet Sarah didn't feel like a stranger anymore. Over the past few weeks, their bench conversations had become the highlight of his days. There was something about her that reminded him of his best students, and genuine curiosity about the world, a willingness to engage with ideas rather than just trade pleasantries. The walk to the park felt different today, the weight of the cookies in his jacket pocket like a secret waiting to be shared. He arrived early, using the time to brush a few fallen leaves off their bench. Their bench, he'd started thinking of it that way without realizing it. Sarah appeared right on schedule, today wearing a navy sweater that looked casually expensive. She had a way of dressing that suggested money without drawing attention to it, though Thomas doubted she gave it much thought. "I brought something today," he said after their usual greetings. He pulled out the carefully wrapped package, suddenly self-conscious. "My wife's recipe. Well, her mother's originally, I think." Sarah accepted the package with visible surprise, unwrapping it carefully. The scent of oatmeal and cinnamon drifted between them. "These look wonderful," she said, picking up a cookie with the kind of reverence usually reserved for fine china. "They're not fancy," Thomas felt compelled to add. "Just something Margaret, my wife, used to make." "Used to?" Sarah asked, gently, catching the past tense. Thomas nodded, his throat tightening slightly. "She passed away 18 months ago. Cancer." He hadn't meant to share that, but somehow it felt right. Sarah was quiet for a moment, holding the cookie, but not eating. "I'm so sorry," she said finally, and unlike the many times he'd heard those words, her sympathy felt genuine rather than obligatory. "It's the first time I've baked since," he admitted. "Found the recipe card last night and, well, sometimes you have to do something with your hands when your heart is full." Sarah took a bite of the cookie then, closing her eyes briefly. "These are perfect," she said softly. "Thank you for sharing them, both the cookies and the story." They sat in comfortable silence, sharing cookies and watching a group of children. Flying kites in the distance. Thomas noticed Sarah's careful posture relax slightly, her shoulders losing some of their habitual tension. "My father used to bake," she said suddenly, as if the words had escaped without permission. "Nothing fancy like these, just basic bread. But on Sundays, our whole apartment would smell like it. He'd work 6 days a week at the garage, but Sundays were for baking and Bach." Thomas caught the flicker of something in her eyes, longing perhaps or regret. She spoke so rarely of herself that each small revelation felt significant. "Bach?" he asked, offering her another cookie. "A man of good taste, your father." He said Bach's mathematics made sense to him. As a mechanic, he understood the precision, the way all the parts worked together. She smiled at the memory, then seemed to catch herself, as if she'd said too much. Thomas noted the way she shifted topics after personal revelations, like someone used to keeping secrets. But he also saw how each shared story, each small truth, built a bridge between them. The recipe card in his pocket, with its smudged measurements and loving notes in the margins, had opened a door today. "More coffee," he offered, reaching for his thermos. The afternoon light was softening, painting the park in gentle autumn colors. Sarah nodded, holding out her cup, and Thomas noticed her hands were slightly stained with cookie crumbs, a small human detail that made her seem more real somehow. Sarah stared at the headlines splashed across her tablet screen. "Anderson Tech faces hostile takeover bid. Morrison Corp makes aggressive move." Her reflection in the penthouse windows looked ghostly against the pre-dawn Manhattan skyline. Dark. Circles under her eyes, testament to a sleepless night of emergency meetings. The board is assembled in the conference room. Her assistant's voice came through the intercom. Mr. Bradley says it's crucial. I know what Bradley thinks is crucial, Sarah cut in, her voice sharper than intended. She softened her tone. Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes. Her phone buzzed with another message from the legal team. The Morrison deal had gone sideways in the worst possible way. Instead of a clean acquisition, they were now facing a hostile takeover attempt that threatened everything she'd built. Thousands of jobs hung in the balance, along with the future of projects that could genuinely change lives. She glanced at her watch, 10:47 a.m. In 4 hours, Thomas would be walking to their bench, thermos in hand, probably already thinking about what books they might discuss today. The thought made her chest tight. The conference room fell silent as she entered. 12 faces turned toward her, a mix of concern and barely concealed panic. The Wall Street Journal lay open on the table, their company's potential fate dissected. In black and white. Walk me through it, she said, taking her seat at the head of the table. Bradley launched into an explanation, his usual polish cracking under stress. Morrison Corp had been playing them, using the acquisition talks as cover while they quietly bought up shares through shell companies. Now they were positioning for a board coup, promising shareholders a 40% premium if they succeeded. Hours blurred, together in a parade of lawyers, financial advisors, and strategy sessions. Sarah's technology empire had disrupted industries, but Morrison was old money, old power, and they played by different rules. We need to call an emergency shareholder meeting, Bradley insisted. Today, right now. If we show panic, we're finished, Sarah cut in. Her mind raced through scenarios, weighing options against consequences. Get me everything you have on Morrison's Asian subsidiaries. The numbers don't add up, and I want to know why. She glanced at her watch again. 2:30 p.m. Thomas would be leaving for the park soon. The thought of him waiting there, watching other park-goers pass by, made her feel oddly guilty. Ms. Anderson, one of the junior analysts, handed her a stack of reports. The preliminary findings on Morrison's shell companies. She dove back into work, but part of her mind kept tracking time. 2:47 p.m. Thomas would be arriving at the bench now, probably brushing off any leaves before sitting down. 3:00 p.m. He'd be pouring his first cup of coffee, maybe sharing some with the philosophical pigeons. There, she said suddenly, pointing to a line item buried in the subsidiary reports. That's our leverage. Morrison's been cooking their books in Singapore. If we can prove it, we need at least 3 days to verify, her head of research. He said, you have until midnight. Sarah's tone left no room for argument. And get me their former CFO on the phone. The one who resigned suddenly last year. He'll talk if we approach him right. For 15 p.m. Thomas would be wondering if she was coming. Would he be worried? Or would he just assume she was like everyone else in New York, too busy or too self-absorbed to maintain connections? The room had emptied somewhat, the initial crisis giving way to focused work groups. Sarah stood at the window, watching the sun set behind the city's towers. Her empire was under attack, and she was thinking about a man on a park bench. The absurdity of it almost made her laugh. Ms. Anderson, her assistant, appeared at her elbow. The former CFO is on line 1, and there's something else. The press is asking questions about your recent absences. There are photos circulating of you in Central Park. Sarah felt her worlds colliding. The bench, her refuge from all this, was becoming another battlefield. She thought of Thomas, probably home by now, perhaps wondering if their friendship had been as meaningful to her as it had become to him. Get me everything on those photos, she said quietly, and reschedule everything for tomorrow morning. I need to think. Alone in her office, she pulled up the security feed from Central Park on her tablet. The bench was empty now, dark with evening shadows. But she could almost see them there, the literature professor and the secret billionaire sharing coffee. and conversations about life's great questions, neither one fully honest, but both somehow more real in each other's company than anywhere else. Thomas arrived at the bench the next day, carrying not just his usual thermos, but also a wooden box tucked under his arm. He'd spent the previous afternoon waiting, watching the shadows lengthen across the empty space beside him. Her absence had felt heavier than he'd expected, a reminder of how quickly one could grow accustomed to companionship. The chess set had been Margaret's gift for their 35th anniversary. "To keep that brilliant mind of yours sharp," she'd said. The pieces were well worn, carrying the patina of countless games and conversations. He hadn't played since she passed, but this morning something had prompted him to dust off the box. He was arranging the pieces when he sensed her approach. Sarah looked different today, tired perhaps, or carrying some invisible weight. "I'm sorry about yesterday," she said, settling onto the bench. The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been rehearsing them. "No need for apologies," Thomas replied, continuing to set up the board. "Life happens to all of us." Sarah watched his hands moving across the board, her expression softening. "Chess? I thought we might try something different today." He finished placing the last pawn. "Unless you'd prefer our usual philosophical pigeons." A genuine smile broke through her fatigue. "I'd like that, though I should warn you, I played a bit in college." "Just a bit?" Thomas raised an eyebrow, recognizing the deliberate understatement in her tone. "Well, let's see what you remember." They began to play, and Thomas quickly realized that Sarah's modesty had indeed been false. She moved with the confidence of someone who had spent considerable time studying the game, her strategies revealing layers of forethought. "You're full of surprises," he commented after she executed a particularly elegant combination. "Sometimes I surprise myself," she replied, her focus on the board masking something in her voice. "Yesterday, for instance, I had to make some difficult decisions, the kind that keep you up at night." She looked up then, meeting his eyes. "Yes, the kind that affect other people's lives." Thomas moved his bishop, creating a subtle threat she'd have to address. "You know, I used to tell my students that literature and life share something fundamental. There are rarely perfect choices, only human ones. What if the choice is between truth and kindness?" The question seemed to escape before she could catch it. Ah, the eternal dilemma. Thomas sat back, studying not the board but her face. "I once taught a seminar on ethical decisions in literature. It's fascinating how often that particular conflict appears. Truth versus kindness, honesty versus compassion." Sarah moved her knight, though Thomas noticed her hand trembled slightly. "And what did you conclude? That perhaps they're not always as opposed as we think." He countered her move, setting up a long-term positional advantage. "Sometimes what appears to be a binary choice is really about timing, about understanding, when people are ready for truth, and how best to honor both the facts and the feelings involved." A police siren wailed in the distance, and Sarah tensed almost imperceptibly. Thomas pretended not to notice, instead focusing on the game. "Your move," he said gently. She studied the board intently, but he suspected her mind was elsewhere. Finally, she moved her queen in an unexpectedly aggressive play. "Sometimes," she said, "I think we hide behind kindness when we're really protecting ourselves." "Perhaps," Thomas responded to her attack with a subtle defensive move. "Or perhaps unkindness to others and protection of self aren't mutually exclusive. We're all carrying things we're not ready to share, burdens we're not ready to put down." Sarah's next move was a mistake, her strategy wavering as his words hit home. Thomas saw the opening but chose not to take it, instead making a move that would prolong the game. They played on as the afternoon light softened, their conversation weaving between the philosophical and the personal, neither quite saying what they meant but both understanding more than they voiced. The chess pieces became proxies for larger truths, each move a statement about trust, risk, and the careful dance of human connection. The clouds had been gathering all afternoon, turning the sky the color of old bruises. Thomas watched them warily, but neither he nor Sarah seemed willing to cut their conversation short, despite the threatening weather. They were deep in a discussion about King Lear and the nature of family obligations when the first fat drops of rain began to fall. "My umbrella's seen better days," Thomas said apologetically, pulling out a weathered black umbrella with one slightly bent rib. "But I insist. You share it." The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the canvas as he opened it. Sarah hesitated only a moment before moving closer under its shelter. "There's a diner around the corner," she said, pointing toward Columbus Avenue. "Perhaps we could wait out the storm there?" They made their way through the increasingly heavy rain, forced to walk close together under the umbrella's limited protection. Thomas was acutely aware of Sarah trying to ensure he stayed equally covered, even though it meant the shoulder of her expensive-looking sweater was getting damp. The diner was a throwback to another era, with red vinyl booths and chrome fixtures that had lost their shine decades ago. A bell chimed as they entered, and the warm aroma of coffee and grilled onions enveloped them. "Haven't been in here for years," Thomas mused, shaking out his umbrella. "Margaret and I used to come sometimes after evening concerts at Lincoln Center." The waitress, whose name tag read Betty, led them to a booth by the window. The vinyl seats squeaked as they sat down, and Thomas noticed Sarah taking in her surroundings with careful attention, as if memorizing details for later. "Coffee?" Betty asked, already setting down 2 thick ceramic mugs that had survived countless customers and conversations. "Please," they said in unison, then shared a smile at the synchronicity. Outside, the rain transformed the city street into an impressionist painting, lights blurring into watercolor streaks. Inside, the diner felt like a pocket universe, separate from the world of park benches and carefully maintained distances. "Your umbrella," Sarah said suddenly. "The bent rib. There must be a story there." Thomas ran his hand along the handle, smoothed by years of use. "There is, actually. I was walking home one evening and saw an elderly woman struggling with her groceries in the rain. Offered to help, of course. The wind caught us both by surprise, saved her papers from flying away, but the umbrella took the hit. You didn't. Replace it? Never seemed necessary. It still keeps the rain off, more or less. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "it's earned its character." Betty returned with the coffee pot and 2 menus worn soft at the edges. "Soup's good today," she offered. "Homemade chicken noodle, the normalcy of the moment." The aged menus, the homey soup recommendation, seemed to relax something in Sarah's posture. She ordered the soup. Thomas chose a grilled cheese sandwich, remembering how Margaret had always claimed this diner made them perfectly crispy. "You know," Sarah said, cradling her coffee mug with both hands, "I can't remember the last time I sat in a place like this. Really sat, I mean, not just rushed through." "That's the thing about diners," Thomas replied. "They're one of the few places left where time moves at its own pace. No one's trying to turn the tables quickly or impress with fancy presentations." Their food arrived, steam rising from the soup bowl and the sandwich golden brown on thick cut bread. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the rain creating a gentle backdrop to the quiet clink of spoons and mugs. "My father would have loved this place," Sarah said softly, almost to herself. Then, with more presence, "He always said you could judge a city by its diners. Not the fancy restaurants, the places where regular people came to eat and talk and be human together." Thomas noted how she spoke of her father in the past tense, but didn't press. Instead, he broke his sandwich in half and offered her a piece. She accepted, and they continued their earlier discussion about King Lear, now punctuated by the sharing of food and the steady rhythm of the rain. The rain showed no signs of letting up, turning the diner's windows into streaming waterfalls. Betty had brought them fresh coffee in chipped mugs that had probably seen thousands of refills, the ceramic worn smooth at the rim from countless conversations. "You really should try the pie," Thomas said, gesturing toward the rotating display case. "Margaret always said their apple pie was the best in Manhattan. Of course, she might have been biased. She loved that they served it with those little packets of cinnamon sugar." Sarah noticed how his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee. There was something in his voice too, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. "2 slices of apple pie, Betty," Sarah called out, making the decision for them. "With cinnamon sugar if you have it." "Always do, honey," Betty replied with a warm smile. "Some things here never change." Thomas stared down at his empty soup bowl, his fingers tracing the pattern on the worn tablecloth. "I haven't been entirely honest," he said finally. "About why I spend so much time in the park." Sarah felt her chest tighten, her own secret suddenly heavy in her throat. "The medical bills," he continued, his voice dropping. "When Margaret got sick, we thought we were prepared. Good insurance, savings, everything they tell you to have. But cancer, it has a way of eating through more than just the body." The pie arrived, 2 generous slices with scoops of vanilla, ice cream slowly melting at their edges. Betty set them down quietly, sensing the gravity of the moment. "The experimental treatments weren't covered," Thomas went on, picking up his fork but not eating. "We knew that, but how do you say no when there's even a chance? So we spent everything. Savings, retirement, even took a second mortgage. I would have sold my soul if they'd taken that as payment." Sarah sat perfectly still, her own pie untouched. Every instinct honed by years in the corporate world screamed at her to solve this, to pull out her phone and make the problem disappear with a few keystrokes. But she knew that would shatter something far more valuable than money could buy. "The park," Thomas said, finally looking up at her. "It's free. The bench doesn't care what's in your wallet. The pigeons don't check your credit score. And sometimes—" He paused, struggling with the words. "Sometimes it's easier to feel rich in stories and conversations than to face another stack of bills." A particularly loud crash of thunder made them both jump slightly. Sarah's hands clenched around her coffee mug, its chip pressing into her palm. "I used to tell my students that dignity isn't about what you have," Thomas continued, his voice steadying. "It's about how you carry yourself through life's storms. But some days, when I'm choosing between filling prescriptions and paying the heating bill," he let out a long breath. "Some days, dignity feels like a luxury I can't afford." Sarah thought about the morning's board meeting, where they discussed millions as if they were pocket change. She thought about her closet full of clothes that cost more than Thomas's monthly pension. The distance between their worlds felt both vast and meaningless in that moment. "You know what I miss most?" Thomas asked, finally taking a bite of his pie. "Not the big things. It's the small luxuries. Buying fresh flowers for no reason. Treating a student to coffee when they seem down. Margaret's favorite hand cream, ridiculously expensive, but it was the only thing that helped with her arthritis." A sudden memory hit Sarah, her father. Counting coins at their kitchen table, trying to scrape together enough for her school field trip. He'd worn the same work boots for years, resoling them again and again, but he'd always managed to find money for her books. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "accepting help isn't about losing dignity. Sometimes it's about allowing others the dignity of giving." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, then smiled sadly. "Wisdom worthy of our philosophical pigeons." He took another bite of pie, then added quietly, "Thank you. Not for the pie, though it is as good as Margaret remembered. Thank you for listening without trying to fix everything." Sarah felt the weight of her checkbook in her purse like a stone, knowing she could solve his problems with a single signature. Instead, she picked up her own fork, sharing this simple meal in this humble diner, understanding that some forms of wealth couldn't be measured in dollars. Mike Chen adjusted his telephoto lens, focusing on the odd pair on the park bench. Through the viewfinder, he watched Sarah Anderson, pour coffee from a battered thermos into a plastic cup. Business Insider had just valued her company at $86 billion, yet here she was, sitting on a park bench with an elderly man like they were old friends. "Got something interesting?" His editor's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Very," Mike replied softly, capturing another frame as Sarah laughed at something her companion said. Anderson's been disappearing from her office at the same time every day. Now we know why. The morning's tech blogs were already buzzing with speculation about Anderson Tech's unusually hands-off CEO during the Morrison crisis. The company's stock had stabilized, but questions remained. Who was this mysterious woman who'd built an empire from her garage, then seemingly vanished during one of the company's most crucial moments? Mike had spent 15 years building his reputation as the city's most tenacious investigative reporter. The Post had sent him after corrupt politicians, Wall Street fraudsters, and mob bosses. But Sarah Anderson was different. She'd managed to maintain her privacy in an age when privacy seemed like a quaint relic. Through his lens, he watched the man pull out a chess set. The pieces caught the afternoon light as they played, their conversation appearing animated but too distant to hear. Mike zoomed in on Anderson's face. Gone was the stern expression from her rare press appearances. She looked almost young, almost ordinary. "Who's the old guy?" his editor asked. "Working on it," Mike replied, snapping another series of photos. "But here's the interesting part. She's been meeting him regularly, always at the same time. And, get this, she dresses down, no security detail, like she's trying to be invisible." His research had turned up the basics about the man, Thomas Mitchell, retired professor, widower. The interesting part was his financial situation, nearly bankrupted by medical bills. Mike could already see the headline, "Tech Billionaire's Secret Park Bench Meetings with Bankrupt Professor." But something about the scene gave him pause. The way they leaned into their conversation, the genuine smiles, the comfortable silences. This wasn't a scandal, it was something else entirely. "Keep on it," his editor instructed. "If Anderson's cracking under pressure, our readers deserve to know." Mike lowered his camera, watching as Sarah moved a chess piece with careful deliberation. He'd made his career exposing secrets, but he'd also learned to recognize the difference between a story that needed telling and one that might destroy something valuable. A jogger passed close to his position, and he instinctively stepped deeper. Into the shadows of the trees, Sarah glanced up at that moment, her eyes scanning the park with sudden alertness. For a brief second, Mike thought she looked directly at his hiding spot, but then Thomas said something that drew her attention back to their game. Mike's phone buzzed. A news alert about Anderson Tech's stock jumping 5 points after rumors of a counter-strategy against Morrison. The contrast was stark. In one world, Sarah Anderson was a corporate warrior commanding billions. In another, she was just a woman playing chess in the park. He raised his camera again, capturing the gentle way she handled the chess pieces, the respectful attention she gave her companion. These weren't the photos his editor wanted, but they were the truth he was seeing. Two people who had found something genuine in an increasingly artificial world. "Got anything juicy?" His editor's voice crackled again. Mike watched as Sarah lost her piece and laughed, genuinely delighted by her opponent's clever move. "Still gathering facts," he replied carefully. "Story might not be what we thought." The autumn breeze carried fragments of their conversation, something about Shakespeare, then shared laughter. Mike's finger hovered over the shutter button, but he couldn't bring himself to capture this moment. Some things, he realized, deserved to remain unpublished, unshared, pure. The photos he'd already taken felt heavy in his camera's memory card. They'd make headlines, drive traffic, probably win awards. But as he watched Sarah Anderson, one of the world's most powerful women, spontaneously share a candy bar with her elderly friend, Mike understood that not every story needed to be told, at least not yet. The bench sat empty that Thursday afternoon. Sarah checked her watch for the third time, though she knew exactly what time it was. 3:17 p.m., 30 minutes after Thomas's usual arrival time. The November wind whipped around her, carrying the first real bite of winter, but it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. Something was wrong. Thomas had never missed their meetings, not once in the month since that first shared coffee. Even during last week's brief snow flurry, he'd arrived with his thermos and a joke about Antarctic penguins envying their philosophical pigeons. She stood, pacing the path in front of their bench. Her watch buzzed, Bradley wanting to discuss the Morrison countermeasures, but she ignored it. Instead, she found herself walking toward the park exit, then along Columbus Avenue. She knew his building was somewhere in this direction. He'd mentioned cross streets once in passing. The sight of Mrs. Rodriguez watering her plants on the fire escape caught her attention. Sarah recognized her from Thomas's descriptions, the kind neighbor who always checked on him. Before she could second-guess herself, Sarah approached the building's entrance. "Excuse me," she called up to Mrs. Rodriguez. "I'm looking for Thomas Mitchell." The woman's face creased with worry. "Oh, you must be the friend from the park. He's not here. Mount Sinai Hospital, early this morning." Sarah felt the world tilt slightly. What happened? His heart. They think it was a minor attack, but with his age. Mrs. Rodriguez twisted her watering can anxiously. "I found him when I brought over some soup. He didn't want me to call an ambulance, can you imagine? Worried about the cost, even then." Sarah's own heart seemed to stutter. She thanked Mrs. Rodriguez and was halfway down the block before she realized she was running. Her security team, always discreetly nearby, despite her attempts at privacy, materialized at her side. "Get the car," she ordered. "Mount Sinai, now!" In the backseat of her town car, Sarah's fingers hovered over her phone. One call to the hospital board. She'd donated a wing last year, and she could have every detail of Thomas's condition, could ensure he received the best care available. Another call could wipe out his medical debt, set up a trust fund, solve every financial worry he'd ever shared during their conversations. But she remembered his words in the diner about dignity, being how you carry yourself through life's storms. Would her help feel like a rescue or a revelation of just how deep her deception ran? The hospital corridor smelled of antiseptic and anxiety. Sarah approached the nurse's station, suddenly conscious that she didn't even know his middle name, had no right to ask about his condition. Through a doorway, she caught a glimpse of him, pale against white sheets, a hospital bracelet stark against his skin, monitors beeping out the rhythm of his vulnerability. A doctor was reviewing his chart, frowning at whatever the numbers told her. Sarah overheard fragments. "Need to run more tests. Cardiac catheterization. Insurance coverage limitations." She retreated before Thomas could see her, finding a quiet corner where she could think. Her phone buzzed again. The Morrison situation was reaching a critical point. The media was asking questions about her absences. Her carefully constructed worlds were colliding with increasing speed. Sarah Anderson, the billionaire CEO, could solve all of Thomas's problems with a single phone call. But Sarah, the woman who shared coffee and chess games, who had found something real in their conversations about literature and life, that Sarah might lose something precious in the process. She looked down at her hands, manicured nails, and a watch that cost more than Thomas's annual pension. Somewhere in the hospital, machines beeped out the heartbeat of a man who had shared his stories, his wisdom, and his last cookie with a stranger on a park bench, expecting nothing in return. The weight of her secret felt unbearable now. Every beep of those monitors, every concerned glance from the medical staff who had to consider costs before care, felt like an indictment. She had the power to help, but using it meant revealing the lie at the foundation of their friendship. Sarah leaned against the cold hospital wall, closing her eyes. For the first time since she'd built her empire, all her wealth and power felt useless in the face of this simple human dilemma. The morning paper arrived with Thomas's breakfast tray, an unremarkable routine in the monotony of hospital stays. He hadn't slept well, the unfamiliar beeps and whispers of medical equipment keeping him from true rest. His chest still ached. Though the doctors assured him the worst had passed, he unfolded the New York Post mechanically, then froze. There, splashed across the front page, was a photo that made his heart skip dangerously. Sarah, his Sarah from the park bench, stepping out of a sleek corporate building. But the headline beneath it stopped his breath entirely. Anderson Tech CEO's secret life. Billionaire Sarah Anderson's park bench meetings revealed. The article swam before his eyes, fragments jumping out with devastating clarity. Estimated net worth of $11.2 billion, mysterious absences during corporate crisis, regular meetings with retired professor. Sources suggest possible charitable initiative. A series of photos followed. Sarah in a power suit at a tech conference. Sarah sitting beside him on their bench, caught in mid-laugh. Sarah playing chess, her face softened in concentration. The contrast was stark, undeniable. The woman he'd shared cookies and conversations with was also one of the wealthiest people in the world. His fingers crumpled the paper's edge. Every conversation, every shared moment, replayed in his mind with this new context. Her careful avoidance of personal details, her insights into corporate life, her understanding of both wealth and its absence. It all took on new meaning. He thought of their conversation in the diner when he'd confessed his financial struggles. Had he amused her, this billionaire playing at being ordinary? Had their friendship been real, or was he just an interesting anthropological study? How the other half lived. The door opened, and a nurse entered to check his vitals. She glanced at the paper in his hands, then at him, recognition dawning. Oh, you're the professor from the story. We've all been reading about it this morning. Quite romantic, really, like something from a movie. Thomas let the paper fall to his lap. Could you? I need a moment alone, please. Once the nurse left, he forced himself to read the entire article. The reporter, Mike Chen, had painted a surprisingly nuanced picture. There were no accusations of impropriety, no sensational revelations. Instead, he described their meetings with an almost gentle attention to detail. Their shared laughter, their animated discussions, the way they seemed to forget the world beyond. Their bench. But one detail caught in Thomas's throat like a bone. The article mentioned Anderson Tech's charitable foundation, specifically its recent interest in medical debt relief programs. The timing couldn't be coincidental. His bedside phone began ringing. Reporters probably eager for his side of the story. He let it ring. On the television mounted in the corner, he caught a glimpse of Sarah's face on a news channel. The ticker below, discussing Anderson Tech's stock prices. A wave of exhaustion hit him, and he closed his eyes. He thought of her listening to his stories about teaching, offering genuine insights about his beloved books. Had that been real? The chess games, the shared coffee, the conversations that had become the brightest part of his days, had they meant anything to her? The paper slipped from his fingers to the floor. The photos of their bench meetings scattered across the linoleum like fallen leaves. Outside his window, he could just see the edge of Central Park, their bench hidden somewhere in its autumn bare. Trees. His heart monitor beeped steadily, recording the rhythm of his disappointment, his anger, his confusion. But beneath it all, a deeper ache. The loss of something he hadn't even known was precious until it proved to be built on sand. On the bedside table, his phone rang again. This time, the display showed a number he didn't recognize. He let it ring, turning instead to stare out the window, watching leaves scatter in the wind, carrying away the last remnants of a friendship he now wondered if he'd ever really had. The bench stood empty in the pale December sunlight. Sarah sat in her parked car across from the park entrance, watching people hurry past with shopping bags and holiday preparations. For the first time in months, her afternoon didn't revolve around a 2:47 meeting that wasn't really a meeting. Thomas had been discharged from the hospital 3 days ago. She knew this because her private investigator had told her, not because he'd accepted any of her calls. Her messages at the nurses' station had gone unreturned. The flowers she'd sent had been donated to the pediatric ward. She understood, of course. Understanding didn't make it hurt any less. Miss Anderson, her driver's voice was gentle. The board meeting starts in 20 minutes. Sarah nodded, but didn't move. Through the tinted windows, she watched their bench. No, just the bench now. Gather a dusting of snow. A pair of pigeons landed nearby, pecking hopefully at the ground where Thomas used to scatter crumbs. Meanwhile, across the city, Thomas stood at his apartment window, staring down at the wilting plants on Mrs. Rodriguez's fire escape. The hospital bracelet still circled his wrist. He hadn't been able to bring himself to cut it off yet. It served as a reminder of how quickly life could change, how easily certainty could become confusion. His daughter had called from Seattle, having seen the news. "Dad, do you need me to come out there? This must be overwhelming." "I'm fine," he told her, the same words he'd given the reporters who kept calling. It was just a friendship, a misunderstanding, but it hadn't been just anything. And that was the problem. The chess set sat untouched on his kitchen table, pieces frozen in their final game. He'd been winning that day, or she'd been letting him win. Now he questioned everything. The stack of hospital bills on his counter had mysteriously vanished. The hospital administration claimed there had been a clerical error in his account. He knew what that meant, knew whose billions had quietly erased his debt. The help he'd needed had come at the cost of his trust. In her office, 60 floors above Manhattan, Sarah went through the motions of corporate life. She signed documents, approved strategies, watched her company's stock price climb as they successfully fought off Morrison's takeover attempt. None of it felt real. "The media attention is actually working in our favor," Bradley told her during their afternoon briefing. "The human interest angle, the park bench meetings. It's humanizing you, making the company more relatable." Sarah, who felt sick. Their friendship had become a corporate asset, another line item in the public relations strategy. That evening, she found herself walking through the park as darkness fell. The bench was dusted with snow now, pristine and untouched. She brushed off a space and sat, not caring about the cold seeping through her wool coat. In his apartment, Thomas pulled out his old lecture notes, seeking comfort in familiar words. A quote from King Lear jumped out at him. "Time shall unfold what plighted cunning hides." He thought of Sarah's careful omissions, her partial truths. He thought of his own pride, his insistence on facing his struggles alone. The hospital bracelet caught the lamplight, and he finally cut it off, letting it fall among the scattered chess pieces. His heart was stronger now, the doctor said. Strong enough to handle truth, perhaps. Strong enough to recognize that deception and dishonesty weren't always the same thing. Sarah sat on the cold bench until her security team radioed concerned warnings about the dropping temperature. Before leaving, she placed something on the bench, a single pawn from a new chess set carved from marble. She didn't expect Thomas to find it, didn't expect anything anymore, but she needed to leave something behind, some marker of what had been lost. The snow began falling again, covering both their worlds in the same blank whiteness. In their separate spaces, they both watched the snow and remembered conversations about Shakespeare, about truth, about the stories we tell and the ones we keep hidden. The city grew quiet around them, muffled by snow and unspoken words. The scent of Mrs. Rodriguez's arroz con gandules drifted through Thomas's open window, carrying with it memories of countless evenings when she'd brought over a plate, claiming she'd made too much. Tonight, though, she appeared at his door, with not just dinner, but a determined look in her eyes. "Enough," she announced, setting down the plate and pulling up a chair at his kitchen table. "You've been hiding in here for 2 weeks. Even your pigeons are getting worried," Thomas managed. A weak smile. "I'm not hiding, I'm processing." Processing? She picked up one of the chess pieces that still lay scattered across the table, memories of that last, unfinished game. "Is that what we're calling it? Carlos says you haven't been to the park once since you got home. The weather's been cold," he offered weakly. Mrs. Rodriguez fixed him with the same look she'd probably given generations of stubborn children in her years as a school secretary. "Thomas Mitchell, I've known you for 15 years. I watched you walk to that park every day through rain and snow when Margaret was sick because you said it helped you think. The weather isn't the problem." She began gathering the chess pieces, carefully placing each one in its proper place on the board. The familiar sound of wood against wood filled the quiet apartment. You know what I see when I look at these photos. In the paper, I see two people who forgot to be lonely. She lied to me, Thomas said, but the words carried less conviction than they had 2 weeks ago. Did she? Mrs. Rodriguez set the White Queen in place, or did she just want one place in her life where she could be herself? Heaven knows I used to cherish my Sunday afternoons when I first came to this country. 2 hours in the park where I wasn't the foreigner, the outsider, just another person enjoying the sun. Thomas watched as she arranged the pieces with surprising knowledge of their proper positions. You play chess? My father taught me. In Cuba, before everything changed, she placed the last pawn. He was a proud man, like you. When we came here, and had nothing, he refused help from the church, from neighbors. But my mother, she was wise. She told him that sometimes letting people help you is a gift you give them. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something that made Thomas's breath catch. The marble pawn Sarah had left on their bench. Carlos found this yesterday. Beautiful, isn't it? But cold, alone. Chess pieces, like people, only have meaning when they're part of something larger. Thomas picked up the piece, feeling its weight, its solidity. I told her things, personal things, about money, about Margaret, knowing who she was, what she could do with a snap of her fingers. And what has she done? Mrs. Rodriguez interrupted. The hospital bills disappeared, yes. Would you rather be drowning in debt to prove a point about pride? When my Carlos needed surgery last year, our community raised money. Was that charity or love? She stood, gathering her purse. You taught literature, yes? Then you know every great story is about people learning to see beyond their first impressions. Your friend, she didn't come to that bench looking for a charity case. She came looking for something real in a world where everything has a price tag. At the door, she paused. The blessing and curse of age, Thomas, is that we don't have time to waste on pride. Think about what matters more, that she kept her wealth a secret, or that she chose to spend her precious time sharing coffee with a retired professor who treated her like a human being instead of a bank account. After she left, Thomas sat at the chessboard for a long time, holding the marble pawn. He thought about all their conversations, seeing them now through a different lens. Had Sarah been calculating and false, or had she been protecting something precious? The rare gift of being known for who she was rather than what she owned. He placed the marble pawn on the board, its pristine white a stark contrast to the aged wooden pieces. Like their friendship, it was different, unexpected, but perhaps no less valuable for being unconventional. Thomas arrived at the park at 2:30, earlier than their usual time. The December air was crisp, carrying the promise of more snow, but the bench had been cleared. Someone had been keeping it clean. He brushed off a few stray flakes and pulled an envelope from his coat pocket, turning it over in his hands as he waited. He'd written the letter 3 times before getting it right. Now the words felt simultaneously inadequate and overwhelming. Dear Sarah, when I taught the Merchant of Venice, we always discussed how Portia had to hide behind a disguise to speak truth to power. My students usually focused on the deception, but the deeper theme was about how titles and position can become barriers to honest connection. I've been thinking about why you chose to share that bench with me, and more importantly, why you chose to keep coming back. In all our conversations about literature and life, you never once looked at your phone, never rushed to leave, never treated our time as less valuable than your billions. Perhaps we were both hiding, you behind simplicity, me behind pride. But what we found in that space between pretense and pride was real. The pigeons miss their philosophical discussions, and I find I miss them too. Thomas. At 2:47 precisely, he heard footsteps on the path. Sarah appeared wearing a simple wool coat rather than the power suits he'd seen in recent photos. She stopped short when she saw him, her composure cracking for just a moment. Thomas! His name came out like a held breath finally released. I wasn't sure if I'd come. He gestured to the empty space beside him. Apparently our pigeons have been quite despondent. Someone needs to check on their doctoral dissertations. She sat carefully, maintaining a respectful distance. Up close, he could see the subtle signs of strain around her eyes, the weight of weeks spent wondering if their friendship could survive truth. "I got your letter," she said softly. "All 3 versions, actually. Your revisions were quite thorough." Thomas blinked in surprise, then chuckled despite himself. "Let me guess, you have someone who monitors your mail?" "A whole department." She smiled faintly. "Though your letter caused quite a stir, apparently they're not used to handling personal correspondence that quotes Shakespeare. Well, I considered sending a text, but that seemed inadequate for the situation." He pulled out his thermos, the same old battered one they'd always shared. "Coffee?" Sarah's eyes glistened slightly as she accepted the familiar cup. They sat in silence for a moment, steam rising between them like unspoken words. "I wanted and to explain," she began, but Thomas shook his head. "Why did you keep coming back?" he asked instead. "You could have spent these afternoons in board meetings, making millions. Instead, you chose to sit here, drinking coffee from a thermos and arguing about whether Hamlet was truly mad or just ahead of his time." Sarah looked down at her cup, gathering her thoughts. "Do you know what it's like to live in a world where every conversation is a transaction? Where every smile might hide an agenda?" She traced the rim of the cup with her finger. "Here, with you I found something I thought I'd lost, the ability to simply be present, to engage with ideas rather than opportunities." "And the hospital bills?" Thomas asked quietly. "Were handled by my foundation's medical debt program. You weren't singled out, we're helping hundreds of families." She met his eyes. "I didn't do it to prove anything or to buy your friendship. I did it because I could, and because watching someone I care about suffer needlessly when I had the power to help felt worse than risking your anger." Thomas pulled out the marble pawn she'd left on the bench. "Mrs. Rodriguez found this. She had quite a lot to say about pride and friendship. She sounds wise." "She is." He placed the pawn on the bench between them. "She helped me understand that sometimes our disguises aren't masks we hide behind, but shields that protect what's genuine until we're ready to risk being truly seen." Sarah picked up the pawn, its white surface catching the winter light. "And are we ready?" Thomas reached into his other pocket and pulled out his old chess set. "Why don't we find out? Though I should warn you, I've been practicing with Carlos. He's quite ruthless." As they set up the board, mixing wooden and marble pieces together, the afternoon light softened around them. The pigeons gathered hopefully nearby, as if sensing the return of their regular philosophers. The Anderson Mitchell Education Foundation existed first as a series of notes scribbled on paper napkins at their diner, the same one where they'd sheltered from the rain months ago. Sarah watched as Thomas outlined his vision, his eyes bright, with the same passion that had once animated his literature lectures. "The problem with most scholarship programs," he explained, drawing circles on a napkin to represent interconnected support systems, "is that they focus solely on tuition. But it's the hidden costs that often force students to drop out: books, housing, medical care, family obligations." Sarah nodded, adding her own notes to their growing web of ideas. The corporate world had taught her about scalable systems and sustainable growth, but Thomas understood the human element, the real barriers that kept promising students from achieving their potential. "What if," she suggested, "we created something that addresses the whole student, not just their academic needs, but their entire support system?" She thought of her own father, how he'd worked double shifts to keep her in computer classes. Something that helps families help their children succeed. Betty brought them more coffee in the familiar chipped mugs, smiling at their intense discussion. The diner had become their second meeting place, when the weather was too cold for the bench, though. They still made time for their park conversations. "The foundation paperwork arrived this morning," Sarah said, pulling out a thick envelope. "I had my lawyers draw it up based on our discussions. Equal voting rights, shared directorship." She paused, watching his reaction carefully. "I'd like you to be more than just a namesake, Thomas. Your experience, your understanding of what students really need, that's worth more than any amount of funding. Thomas opened the envelope, his fingers tracing their names printed side by side on the official documents. For a moment, he was back in his classroom, watching students discover new worlds in the pages of books. You know, I always told my students that education was about more than just learning facts. It was about opening doors to possibilities. And now we can help open those doors for others, Sarah added, her corporate precision softening into genuine enthusiasm. Think about it. Emergency medical funds so students don't have to choose between textbooks and healthcare. Family support programs so parents don't have to work themselves to exhaustion. Mentorship networks. Reading groups. Thomas continued, catching her excitement. Not just assigned texts, but real discussions about literature and life, like our bench conversations. A place where ideas can flourish without the pressure of grades. They spent hours refining the details, their coffee growing cold as they mapped out a vision that combined Sarah's business acumen with Thomas's educational experience. The foundation would focus first on community colleges, the same ones where Thomas had taught for decades, before expanding to other institutions. There's one more thing, Sarah said, pulling out another document. I've set up a separate endowment for a special project. The Margaret Mitchell Memorial Library. Thomas's hands stilled on the papers. Sarah, not just a building, she continued gently, but a living collection. First edition classics alongside contemporary works, reading rooms designed for comfort and conversation, and a special section for musical scores, honoring both her love of violin and your shared passion for literature. A young waitress approached their table hesitantly. I'm sorry, but I couldn't help overhearing. Are you really starting a foundation to help students? She twisted her order pad nervously. It's just, I've been trying to take classes at the community college, but with my mom's medical bills. Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances, recognizing in this moment the very need they were discussing. What's your name? Thomas asked. Maria. Well, Maria, Sarah smiled, pulling out a business card, not her CEO card, but a new one showing their foundation's logo. Why don't you tell us about your educational goals? As they listened to Maria's story, Thomas watched Sarah. Not Sarah Anderson, the billionaire, but Sarah, his friend, the woman who shared his bench and his vision for changing lives. The foundation documents between them bore both their signatures. Now a bridge between their worlds and a promise to create something meaningful together. 1 year later, the December morning dawned clear and cold, frost crystallizing on the bare branches of Central Park's trees. Thomas stood before their bench, now temporarily draped in a blue cloth. A small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Rodriguez and Carlos, Betty from the diner, Maria in her new college sweatshirt, and a select group of Foundation Scholarship recipients. Sarah stood beside him, and for once she wasn't trying to blend into the background. Today, she wore her CEO persona comfortably, like a favorite coat rather than a suit of armor. The media was there too, including Mike Chen, whose thoughtful article had first exposed their friendship. He'd since written several pieces about the Foundation's work, finding in their story a rare example of wealth creating genuine positive change. Ready? Sarah asked softly. Thomas nodded, stepping forward to address the gathered crowd. A year ago, this bench was just a place to sit and watch the world go by. Then it became something more. A classroom without walls, a boardroom without barriers, and most importantly, a place where two people from very different worlds discovered they spoke the same language. He gestured to the students in the crowd. Many of you have your own bench stories now. Places in the library or campus coffee shop where you gather to discuss ideas, share challenges, and build connections that go beyond academic requirements. That's what education should be. Not just the transfer of knowledge, but the creation of spaces where wisdom and understanding can grow. Sarah stepped forward next, her business polish warmed by genuine emotion. The Anderson Mitchell Foundation. began right here with conversations about literature, life, and the power of genuine human connection. In our first year, we've provided comprehensive support to over 500 students, established 3 emergency medical funds, and created 15 family support centers across the city. She turned to Thomas with a smile. But more importantly, we've proven that when we remove the artificial barriers between different parts of our community, remarkable things can happen. Every student who receives support from our foundation is encouraged to find their own bench, their own space, to build connections and share wisdom across generations and experiences. Together, they pulled away the cloth, revealing a simple bronze plaque set into the bench's back. The philosopher's bench, where wisdom shared becomes wisdom multiplied. Dedicated to the proposition that true friendship knows no barriers. December 2025, a light snow began to fall as the small crowd applauded. The photographers captured the moment, but Thomas and Sarah were looking at something else. A pair of pigeons that had landed nearby, strutting importantly through the fresh snow. "I do believe that's our doctoral candidate," Thomas mused. "The one writing about breadcrumb metaphysics? Looks like he's brought a colleague," Sarah replied with a laugh, "perhaps for a peer review." After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, they sat together on their bench one more time. Sarah pulled out a familiar thermos. "Some things shouldn't change," she said, pouring 2 cups of coffee. Thomas reached into his coat and produced a small package wrapped in wax paper. "Mrs. Rodriguez made cookies, says we can't have a dedication without proper refreshments." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the snow dust the paths and trees with fresh white. Students from the foundation hurried past, carrying textbooks and dreams, each one a living testament to what had grown from their chance encounter. "You know," Thomas said thoughtfully, "in all the classic stories about disguised identities and revealed truths, there's always a moment of crisis when the truth comes out. But the real story is what happens after. How people choose to move forward once all the masks are gone." Sarah nodded, understanding. "And what do you think makes the difference between tragedy and triumph?" "The willingness to see beyond the disguise to the truth that was there all along." He raised his coffee, cup in a small toast. "To truth, time, and pigeons with philosophical aspirations." "To benches," Sarah added, "and the wisdom to know when to sit still long enough for real connection to grow." Above them, the winter sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted park. Their bench, now everyone's, a bench, stood as a quiet testament to the power of authentic connection, its new plaque catching the light like a promise kept.